that there is a definite tie with what happened in the past with what's happening now.
There are so many ways to kind of come at that question, because it is foundationally what Professor Jeffries just said, and the way he started it, that illustrates how difficult this is. That we hate our history, and yet Baldwin says we are our history, so we hate ourselves. And we hate ourselves for what our true history has been. And so therefore we grow nostalgic about a time that didn't exist. I like to comment, particularly in the circles that I tend to hang out in politically from time to time, to the extent that they still let me. This nostalgia for the 1950s. 1950s America, as I like to point out to them, 1950s wasn't that friendly to white folks either. If you lived in Appalachia, you lived in Mississippi, you lived in other parts of the country, this compartmentalized view of America, and it's largely what the founders, I think, did. They compartmentalized it. And what enables you, in my estimation, and certainly having traveled around the country, and particularly over the last 7 or so years, listening more and more to the visceral, hot rhetoric that people have, says to me that compartmentalization is rooted in the dehumanization of others. I no longer see you as a fellow American. I no longer see you as a human being. And therefore, what happens to you, I'm largely indifferent to. And how this story unfolds, I get to write that narrative in my head, irrespective of your experience and your history. I recently had Nicole Hannah-Jones on my podcast, the Michael Steele podcast, and original name, right? And I started off the conversation with her by asking the question, how come when black folks start telling their history, some white folks get real upset? Because it breaks into that compartmentalization. It deconstructs this image that they have of themselves and how they fit into the American story. You cannot excise us from that story. As much as James Madison would look out on these fields and see the Negro working, he could not excise that reality from the story of America. He could not excise the whippings and the beatings and the blood that was shared, as well as the good times and the songs and the religion and the family aspects from the American soil. And so I think that's a big part. The way you opened it, I think, really sort of sets in front of us the problem, the conundrum that we have. And it makes it a real challenge, which is, again, why we need to have these conversations, so that we can begin to see the humanity of each other, and in that humanity recognize the link to history and the relationships that we have one to the other in order to form that more perfect union. And it's a challenge. Professor Reeder, Madison fervently believed in creating this sort of broad view of and really kind of deliberate idea around this system, this governing system of America. What were the results of that in his life that brought him to those conclusions, to sort of write the words, but then sort of ignore the reality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I look at Madison, I think, and when we think about the deliberative system that he created, and the and the republic and the democratic republic, he would have just called it a republic in his time. But when you look at the system that he created, Madison had a few things in mind, and one of the main things that he wanted to create was a system that worked in diversity, a system that worked with diversity and that made diversity an asset rather than a liability, because Madison was a very different type of thinker than a lot of political philosophers of his time. The political wisdom of the time was you cannot create a republic that is so broad, covers so many square miles, so much landmass, and is so diverse as the United States, as these new United States were. Republics, again, this is conventional wisdom, republics work much better in small groups, in homogeneous groups. Otherwise, it's just going to fracture, and it's going to fall apart, and it's going to dissolve too quickly. Madison turns that reasoning on his head. Now, we have to say from the outset, as we've obviously been talking, but I think it's worth stating the obvious. Madison obviously saw diversity in different terms than we do now. And obviously, he enslaved individuals. But that's not to say that early America wasn't diverse. They didn't think in terms of racial diversity or in terms of the body politic, of gender diversity and so forth. But that doesn't mean they were just a big homogenous group of white men who were voting. They were different in terms of religion, of their regionalism, and sometimes even languages that they spoke, nationalities. They were diverse in all sorts of ways. And Madison looked across this broad spectrum, and he said, this is actually what will make the republic work, is this diversity. I don't want to get too Pollyanna about this, but he did say that it's going to be, he essentially said it's going to be the United States diversity that makes it work. Why? Because all of these different groups are going to be vying for power. They'll more or less follow their self-interest, but we can actually make that self-interest work for the United States, make it a part of the system, because nobody can get an oppressive majority. That's one thing that he's really worried about. As opposed to these, smaller, more homogenous republics, you can have a majority. If you're not in the majority in this small homogenous group, life is going to be really, really difficult for you. And so he said, actually, this is going to work much better across this broad, diverse republic. And again, he thought of diversity very differently than we do. But I think that we can take lessons from the way that he originally thought about the republic and incorporate them into our political culture today. And I think that, now this didn't end up working out the way that Madison imagined it would. I mean, Madison, he would have called them factions. Today we'd call them political parties. Right. We don't need to spend too much time on the finite differences between the two, but he imagined a lot of different parties that are going to be vying for power. And the problem is, and he didn't really realize this at the time, with the structure, especially from the Electoral College, the structure that was built into the Constitution, when you say that a presidential candidate, for instance, needs 50% plus one of the electoral votes to be elected, that's going to give all of these small coalitions an incentive to say, well, we may not agree on a lot of things, but let's actually conglomerate into like two big, just two main parties and create a two-party system, each vying for that precious 50% plus one. And so it didn't turn out the way that Madison imagined.